Chapter 14. Evicted. A stampede of nearly 200 Nui Jaga scurried through the Tiro Canyon of Pauahi as they fled their long-established nesting grounds from the rolling swarm of crimson Bohrok that drove them out. Most tried to hold their ground, even tearing down many of the Bohrok's numbers, but were quickly incinerated in droves before finally realizing they were outmatched and evacuated. Once the colossal scorpion Rahi had properly removed themselves from the path of the Tanakh, the invading creatures immediately got to work at torching the sparse greenery that grew at the bottom of the canyon, as they were soon joined by an even larger swarm of Bohrok that began cracking apart the stone walls.
Are you sure this is going to work?
Gali asked as she looked down at the destruction from the top of the canyon.
I sure hope so,
Pohatu replied, peering over the edge on his hands and knees.
It took me all morning to get it set up. I think I'll leave the tunneling to Onewa next time. I still feel lightheaded.
Then perhaps you shouldn't be leaning so far over the edge.
It's not that bad.
Pohatu dismissed with a wave of his hand, which caused him to rock a bit too far forward before stabilizing himself. Without a word, he heeded the Toa of Water's advice and inched back away from the drop. Earlier that day, Pohatu had begun tracking the Bohrok swarm the moment it crossed into Pauahi. With the swarm being among the largest he had seen yet, he knew he needed to find a way to outsmart them, rather than facing them all head-on. Once he had deduced they were headed toward Tiro Canyon, he devised a plan involving him using his control over stone to carve out a tunnel leading from the nearby sea, stopping just before breaking out into the canyon wall, which now acted as a dam. The process had turned out to be much more strenuous than he had initially expected, but when he had finally finished, he had learned that Gali had arrived in hopes of aiding the other Toa, as her Wahi had still yet to be invaded by the Bohrok. Now with her help, the options of what to do once the Bohrok had broken the dam were far more plentiful.
The tunnel should be right around there,
Pohatu said, pointing toward a spot near the center of the canyon on the other side. The Bohrok were rapidly breaking away large chunks of the rock as they unknowingly inched toward the area.
Do you think you'd be able to redirect the flood once they're dealt with?
That should be easy enough. But what were you planning on doing with it before I showed up?
I hadn't gotten that far. Hey, look! They're almost there!
The Bohrok swarm had reached the weak point of the canyon walls, chipping away indiscriminately until it was punctured. Geysers of seawater shot out from the growing cracks, blasting away the Bohrok in its area. Within seconds, the stone wall crumbled, making way for a sweeping flood to rush through the entire canyon. Hundreds of Bohrok were swept off their feet, save for the few dozen possessing shielding Kana. The flood levels filled nearly a third of the way up the canyon before evening out.
It looks like your plan worked,
Gali said.
but it won't delay them forever. I'm going down there.
Pohatu nodded in approval of her plan. Before she could prepare to dive, many of the submerged Bohrok began to rise from the surface of the water, levitating up into the air. They stopped once they reached over the top of the canyon, where they hovered fixedly with their sights set on the Toa.
Hey, look! There's a new Kana power.
Pohatu observed.
I'll handle these guys. You go ahead.
I'll be swift.
Gali affirmed before leaping over the edge of the drop and positioning herself into a perfect dive. The moment she pierced the water, she locked on to the nearest Bohrok, which was helplessly flailing as it drifted toward the bottom. Drawing her weapons, she darted forward, hooking onto its headplate and wrenching it open. The Kana ejected from its body and slowly floated to the surface. Without wasting a second, she set her sights on the next Bohrok, repeating the tactic. With the beasts unable to fight back while struggling in the water, this was proving to be a remarkably easy task. Meanwhile, Pohatu stomped into the rock. From the attachment on his foot, he conjured a sizable boulder from the ground, which was formed into a near-perfect sphere. He selected the first of the hovering Bohrok and reared his leg back. The crack of the impact from his hammer-like addition pierced the desert as the stone soared into the face of its target, smashing it in and causing the Bohrok to plummet back down into the water. Pohatu pumped his fist in approval before conjuring another boulder. He was out of range for the Tanakh to blast their jets of flame toward him, while the Bohrok had no means of attacking from a distance. This forced them to simply attempt to evade and maneuver away from Pohatu's boulders, making themselves far more difficult to strike. For every successful hit, he had a few misses. Still, he managed to slowly take them out. A few of them fled the battle entirely, until only one remained, a Bohrok. He kicked another boulder, missing the Bohrok. A second shot missed again, as well as the third. Seeing it begin to turn and flee with the rest, he activated his Kanohi Kakama. Gaining a running start, he leaped over the edge of the canyon. He rode the momentum through the air, positioning his body as the Bohrok tried to escape. Just before it evaded the Toa's outstretched arm, he secured a grip on its ankle. The sudden load of Pohatu's hefty body caused the Bohrok to jerk downward as it struggled to fly away. Pohatu grabbed its other ankle, turning the protesting Bohrok into a makeshift hang glider as it slowly descended from his anchoring body mass. The Bohrok jabbed at Pohatu's fingers with its clawed middle limbs, but he maintained his grip. Soon after, it powered up its hand shields, which, based on what Turaga Onewa had told them, made the act of holding on no longer worth it. He let go of its feet one hand at a time, causing it to shift off balance before swinging himself off. He fell toward the canyon wall, snatching a handhold just before he could land in the water. Down below, Gali wrenched open yet another headplate and tore out the Kana inside. Moving at an impossibly swift speed underwater, she had lost count of how many she had removed, but estimated it to be at least 3 or 4 dozen within a few minutes. As she spotted her next target, she could feel a shift in the water's temperature. It was subtle at first, but as she swam along, she could feel the heat rise. As mere seconds passed, she began to feel as though she were swimming in a cauldron. Looking around, she could see the remaining Tanakh had ignited their hand shields, causing the waters to come to a boil. Fighting through the pain, Gali yanked out another Kana before being forced to swim to the surface. Her muscles burned as she shot out from the surface of the water, burying her hooks into the side of the rock. Coincidentally, she found herself next to Pohatu, who also clung to the side of the canyon wall. Both Toa looked down, watching the waters boil as the rolling steam clouded their vision.
What happened down there?
Pohatu asked.
They adapted to the situation.
Gali panted.
It looks like we'll have to as well.
Pohatu and Gali carefully scaled the canyon wall. Pohatu used his feet additions to shape footholds into the stone to make the climb easier, with Gali following closely behind. Once he had reached the top, he turned back to pull Gali up the rest of the way. Taking a brief moment to catch their breath, they both sat up to form their next plan.
Were you able to take any out?
Pohatu asked.
Yes,
Gali replied.
many still remain, but I made a sizable dent.
Nice work. Now we deal with the rest, and then find a way to drain all this water.
Just as Pohatu finished speaking, the remaining swarm of submerged Tanakh began climbing out of the water. Their hand shields had reached such high temperatures that allowed them to melt handholds into the rock walls. Those that had yet to climb free must have been increasing the intensity of their shields, as the scalding steam that escaped into the air became so intense that the Toa were forced to pull away from the edge. Gali blasted the climbing Tanakh with thin water jets in hopes of knocking them off their climb, but most of them withstood the force of the streams head-on. Pohatu conjured more boulders to drop down onto them, which was far more successful, but still not enough to stop them all from climbing to the top. Suddenly, the entire canyon rattled violently, causing cracks to rip up from the water. The surviving Bohrok had managed to bore into the rock and continued their destruction even while submerged. Chunks of the walls broke away as the cracks thickened, reaching the top. The tremors prevented Pohatu from properly aiming the stones at the climbing Tanakh, though the shaking walls caused by their allies had caused more than a few to lose their hold and fall back into the water. Gali leaped back as the section of the canyon she stood on snapped free and slid over the edge. Pohatu was forced to do the same.
Looks like they win this round.
Pohatu called over the earthquake. He activated his Kanohi Kakama, and without warning, scooped Gali off her feet before blasting away. The entire canyon formation cracked and crumbled as Pohatu raced around the destruction, hopping and dodging the loosening stone and falling boulders. The remaining Bohrok ignored the Toa as they made their escape, turning back to their task. Pohatu slid to a stop more than 2 miles away before gently returning Gali to her feet.
I need to stop coming to Pauahi,
Gali said as they watched the entirety of the Tiro Canyon perish from a safe distance.
You won't have any landmarks left otherwise.
We still destroyed a good chunk of them.
Pohatu replied.
Now we'll have a better chance of finishing them off before they reach Po-Koro.
That canyon was full of life. Thousands of Arahi will be displaced. Those that survived, at least. Win or lose, this island will never be the same after this is over.
In that case, we might as well choose to win.
Gali cracked a smile behind her mask before raising her hooks.
Your optimism is infectious, brother.
It tends to be my most useful tool.
A few minutes passed before they could see the remaining swarm begin to depart the remains of the canyon one by one, leaving nothing behind but a miles-wide landfill of rocks and a newly formed body of still simmering water connecting it to the sea. They regrouped, leaving the destruction behind as they sought their next challenge, failing to realize they had just foolishly granted the 2 nearest Toa large quantities of stone and water to work with. Before the Bohrok could get far, Gali hopped onto Pohatu's back as he activated his Kanohi another time and blasted through their ranks, smashing 3 headplates from the impact before slowing down. 2 more nearby Bohrok reacted quickly to the surprised attack, but not quick enough to avoid being lobotomized by Gali's hooks. Together, the pair of Toa made short work of the swarm, utilizing their elemental powers supplemented by their environment. Many Bohrok were swept away while others were crushed. As the fight neared its conclusion, the few remaining Bohrok chose to cut their losses and flee the battle, folding themselves up and rolling off into the empty desert.
Leave them,
Pohatu said.
They make a lot of noise when they travel. That kind of commotion tends to rattle the wildlife. I doubt they'll make it back home.
Gali returned her hooks to her hips, freeing up her hands to clank fists with Pohatu.
Excellent work,
she said proudly.
Po-Koro stands another day.
The Toa turned back toward the village, preparing to return when they spotted a lone Matoran racing toward them on the back of an ussel crab. Once he emerged from the heat mirage of the desert, his distinct colors became distinguishable.
Chronicler,
Gali greeted.
What news have you brought us?
Toa Gali,
Takua replied.
I was sent to find you in Gakoro, but they told me you would be here. Liwahi needs help. The whole region is on fire and no one has seen Toa Liwa. Toa Pohatu should come too.
Done,
Pohatu replied.
Are the Lematoran safe?
No, Toa. The Bohrok have taken control of them. The Onumatoran are launching a non-lethal counterattack. I think they have a solid chance, but they're going to need your help quelling the fires. Please, you have to hurry.
Then hurry we shall. Thank you for the report, Chronicler. We'll see to it immediately.
Thank you, Toa Gali. I'll be riding back to Takura to try to scrape up some more help. They're going to need it.
The following morning, Hafu quickly sat up from his stone bed. His heart still raced from the nightmares he had just escaped from, as he took a sweeping glance of every trinket and self-crafted sculpture that decorated his bedroom to ground himself back to reality, a practice he had grown accustomed to over the last few weeks since the Battle of Kininui. His dreams had always brought him back to that day, forcing him to relive the horrors of watching his fellow Matoran torn apart by infected Rahi. The only thing that had changed since then was that he now dreamt about the Bohrok, and what likely would have happened had he not toppled the statues outside the village. He had long since given up on achieving a restful sleep, accepting that it was not something he would experience for a long time, if ever again. He was exhausted, but awake either way. so he decided to begin the day. He placed his feet on the cold floor before stretching his waking joints. He stood up and walked into the larger room of the small house. His first objective of the day would be to prepare breakfast. He approached the kitchen area when he heard a harsh commotion from outside his open window. Bohrok, he thought. They must have just breached the gate. He rushed toward the door to investigate and yanked it open, where he was met with the startling face of a giant Nui Jaga staring back at him from the city street. Unprepared, he quickly hopped back into his house and shut himself in. He pressed his full weight against the door as he felt the colossal scorpion pound its claws against the other side, demanding entry in the form of glass-shattering hisses. He was quickly losing the battle against the Nui Jaga as it tried to force open the door. He released his hold and made a run for the window on the opposite end of the room as the door was broken down. The giant Rahi tried to squeeze its way into the house, but got stuck in the doorway as Hafu escaped. He ran down the street, making his way to alert the Turaga when his path was blocked by a second Nui Jaga standing in the middle of the street. The beast's back was turned and hadn't yet noticed him. Before he could be spotted, he turned and ran the other way, careful not to make too much noise. His next destination was the market square. He ran down the narrow path, repeatedly looking back over his shoulder to ensure the Nui Jaga had not been following him. He nearly collided with a third Nui Jaga that crept around the corner, this one being made aware of his presence. He turned back just in time to avoid its snapping pincher before it pursued him. Unable to fully double back due to the other two Nui Jaga, he made a sharp turn between two houses, finding himself cornered in a dead-end alleyway. He could see the stretching shadow of the Nui Jaga that followed him, moving slowly toward his position.
Hafu, up here!
Called Hewkii. Hafu looked up to see Hewkii standing on the roof of the house beside Turaga Onewa, who was lowering his hammer staff down toward him. Hafu grabbed the staff and Hewkii assisted the Turaga in pulling him up on the roof just before the Nui Jaga could round the corner and spot him.
Are you alright?
The Turaga asked as he helped the artist to his feet among the flat-roofed home. As Hafu stood up, he noticed nearly the entire population of more than 1,700 Po-Matoran present on the rooftops across the village.
How did this happen?
Hafu asked as he fought to catch his breath.
How did 3 Nui Jaga manage to sneak into our village?
3?
Hewkii asked, pointing toward the streets below.
You may need to count them again.
Hafu glanced over the village, finding dozens of giant scorpion Rahi pillaging their home, smashing down the stalls in the market square, and overturning barrels and baskets in search of more food, feasting on the livestock and trying to gain the traction to climb up the walls of the houses.